to Teresa for introducing meta-ethics today. I thought it would be completely out of left field, but now we are in like a session, it's perfect. And so this paper happened because Luca and I were getting a particular kind of objection every time we presented weak assertion, weak rejection, and one of our referees also raised this objection, and we thought we'd put it to rest. And this objection is known as the negation problem in meta-ethics. I'm going to introduce you to this problem, and it's not so much about ethics, it's really a philosophy of language problem. So you're all more or less familiar with the Frege-Geach problem, I assume. So the connective knot is supposed to express something like dissent. Then Frege asks us, how can the following inference be valid? So if it's not the case that P, then Q is the case. Well, P is not the case, hence Q. This is manifestly and obviously valid, but Frege argues expressions of dissents can't embed conditionals. So if this is expressing dissent, this is still not expressing dissent. So how can this be multi-connected? And this is a very good observation, but no, very few people actually claim something like this, right? But something that many people claim or try to claim is that a moral term like wrong expresses certain attitudes like disapproval, which is just what you call it. So if the term wrong is supposed to express disapproval, then again, how can the following be valid? If it's wrong to A and Q, and wrong here, attitude expressions don't embed, argues Frege, but here this is supposed to mean like I'm expressing disapproval, and this is not, how can this be a valid inference? This is known as Frege-Geach problem because this is Frege and then Geach came along and generalized it to this. So in general, whenever you have an operator that's supposed to express something, as soon as you embed it, you start getting problems. And of course, the bilateralist, or this bilateralist in the fashion of Timothy Smiley, Ian Rumford has an answer to this. He says, yeah, Frege is just right to a certain degree, not just is an embeddable propositional operator, it maps propositions to propositions. But this is really Smiley's very powerful observation. None of this means that there isn't an indicator for dissent. And Smiley's plan is to say like, well, this not here, this is an propositional operator, but asking a question to myself and then answering it negatively, this is an expression of dissent. And indeed, this does not embed, because like, is it the case that P no sounds terrible. So indeed, this is a non-embeddable expression of dissent, and this negation is just an embeddable operator. And Smiley continues, you also can't, now you can say, maybe these two have something to do with each other in some sense that allows us to explain this inference. And so one good case in point, this is again Timothy Smiley. Smiley in modus tollens says, well, if P then Q, is the case that Q? No. And I think we are entitled to infer from this, well, is it the case that P? No. And so we have here a valid inference involving conditional and some attitude expressions, and we don't need to know anything about negation to appreciate this inference. It's just dissent or the attitude expressed by putting a question answering it negatively on its own. And if this works, then why shouldn't this be made to work somehow? However, this is all good and well, but there is now something called the negation version of the Frege-Geach argument, which goes back to Nicholas Unwin, but really has been popularized by Mark Schlöder in 2008 in really a flurry of papers. And the observation is, consider these two utterances here. Murdering is wrong, and murdering is not wrong. So if we are an expressivist, like hair, we say, well, finite A expresses disapproval of murdering. But if you are committed to that claim, you should be able to answer the question, well, what does murdering is not wrong express? And this question is surprisingly difficult to answer, because it can't be like disapproval of not murdering. That's just not what it means, because this is what disapproval of not murdering would be. And it also can't just be the absence of disapproval of murdering, because this would conflate these two here. So I can say about a person, well, Jane thinks that murdering is not wrong. This attributes to Jane a particular kind of attitude. And it seems to be something else than what I attribute to Jane when I say Jane does not think that murdering is wrong. So here, Jane is taking some sort of stance on the ethical properties of murdering. Here, she just doesn't. So the question, what does 5b here mean, is still very much open. And I think the best way of appreciating this is just comparing these two sentences here. So in Jane does not think that not murdering is not wrong, you can insert up to 3 negations. But in the expressivist version of reporting the same events, Jane does not disapprove of not murdering, there's only space for 2 negations. So this one of these negations, namely the one that says not wrong here, doesn't seem to be, can't be paraphrased like this. So how are we going to go about this? And I mean, there's a very obvious intuitive answer to that question. It says, well, not wrong expresses something that is not disapproval. Let's call it tolerance. So if I say murdering is not wrong, then I'm expressing my tolerance of murder. And this word tolerance is really just by fiat. Just you can call it what you want. But even if you do this, and then you have solved then this little problem here, well, the last missing negation is not paraphrased like this, but it's paraphrased as Jane tolerates murder. You still haven't answered why these two here sound inconsistent. Murdering is wrong and murdering is not wrong. The same person can't seem to claim these at the same time. It's not very silly. So the question is, well, what is that attitude of tolerance, and why is it inconsistent, or in some other sense forbidden, that you disapprove and tolerate the same? And we can't just use our natural language intuition what tolerance and disapproval mean here, because they are technical terms and semantics and need to explain where they come from. And really Schlöder analyzes this problem very, very conspicuously. So he says, we have 2 types of inconsistency in our theorizing now. The first one, what we call A-type inconsistency, is when you have the same attitude towards incompatible contents in a way that is inconsistent. And so one of these attitudes that is inconsistency transmitting is belief. So the idea is, I believe that P and I believe that not P is inconsistent because P and not P are inconsistent, and belief kind of raises this inconsistency to the level of attitude. Whereas a B-type inconsistency is a different beast altogether. It's the expression of 2 different attitudes towards the same content in a way that is inconsistent. And one natural example is believing that P and wondering whether P. You can't really have these 2 attitudes at the same time towards the same content. So these are B-type inconsistent. So here you have the same P and 2 different attitudes, and this is somehow bad. Here you have different propositions, P and not P, but the same attitude. This is somehow bad. And what the expressivists need is an explanation of B-type inconsistency, so that disapproval and tolerance are somehow inconsistent. And this is the negation problem. Where is this coming from? So because you can't just create an attitude and logical properties of that attitude by fiat. You can't just stipulate attitudes and logical properties into existence. It's just not how things work. So you need to explain what this is, where it comes from, and why it has these properties. However, there's a little bit of resistance in literature there. So there are natural examples of B-type inconsistencies, like belief and wonder. So, I mean, if belief and wonder is one example, so why can't we say by analogy there would be more examples, and one of them just happens to be tolerance. We just call it tolerance and move on. And this doesn't suffice to solve the negation problem, because at least there's a compositional problem left over. So consider these 2 here. Murdering is not wrong and murdering is not legal. So this is a moral claim, and we want to say it expresses some sort of attitude, but legal is certainly a descriptive term. So murdering is not legal reports some fact about some society, I guess. And so the expressivist wants to say that in 13a not modifies the attitude as being expressed, but in 13b here, the not is modifying content. So this is still expressing a belief. Murdering is legal expresses my belief that it is, and murdering is not legal expresses my belief that it is not. But this difference is not really realized anywhere in natural language. It's not like we have like a not A that modifies contents and a not B that modifies attitudes, which just doesn't happen, and I don't think there's any language where this happens. And it's also not enough to say that, well, natural language negation is ambiguous between the modifying attitude and modifying content reading, because for both of these, the A-type reading of this and the B-type reading of this, they are mandatory. You can't just override them. So an ambiguity doesn't suffice either. So even if we grant to the expressivist the ability to create attitudes and properties by fiat, they still have some explaining to do about the compositionality of negation. And there's a related problem that's about logic. So this is a particular kind of inconsistency. It's a logical inconsistency. Because I don't need to know what murdering is or what wrong is. I just need to know what not means to recognize that you can't agree to these both. So it's a logical inconsistency. But if I have an ambiguity or anything about the meaning of not, if it can mean multiple things, then I at least need to know about wrong as much to determine the intended meaning of not here to recognize this as inconsistent. And this is in fact, this is not specific to the negation problem. In the original frigate problem is also the observation this is a logical inference from murdering. If murdering is wrong, then Q, and murdering is wrong, hence Q. This is a logical inference, and logic needs to explain it. And finally, what I already hinted at a couple of times, the explanatory problem, which is really thought to be the big one here. So if you appeal to this action of tolerance, then you appeal to the following three things. I mean, first, that there genuinely are both A-type and B-type inconsistencies. Second, that whenever you have a term like wrong that realizes a particular attitude, then you get another attitude for free, or generate another attitude, in this case maybe tolerance, that somehow forms its negation. And third, like the logical relations of all these attitudes you've created in the second step, set the right logical relations. If you start thinking this through, 2 and 3 are an incredibly tall order, because if you have this about negation, then you can start thinking about stuff like murdering is legal and murdering is wrong, and murdering is legal or murdering is wrong, and suddenly you have disjunctive attitudes and conjunctive attitudes, and it really goes way out of bounds. And so while we have natural examples of, for one here, these two are outrageous, basically. And the problem here is not one of logic building. It's like it's easy to give a logic that generates all the right attitudes. I can write you one down. But a formal language might simply be something overbroad. So if just because I have a term that in my logic that denotes a certain attitude, it does not guarantee that attitude exists. Right, I have a word for unicorn. There still aren't any unicorns. So the popular or the best solution on the market, again due to Schlöder in one of these many 2008 works, it's called the A-type solution. And his plan is, let's just get rid of B-type inconsistency. It's a notion that's uncomfortable, we don't really know what about, let's just get rid of it. And so he says there's just a single basic attitude that you express whenever you're making an utterance. That attitude is being for something. And it's inconsistency transmitted. And so then his plan is, murdering is legal, so a descriptive claim expresses something like being for proceeding as if murdering is legal. And you can think of this in terms of the common ground if you want to. Like if I put something forward for the common ground, I want to have it in the assumptions, saving the conversation, which means I am putting forward as I am for, we proceed as if this is the case, just add it to common ground. Whereas then he says the normative vocabulary, that like wrong, they express certain action terms. And wrong in this case, we might call it blaming. So if I utter murder is wrong, I'm expressing being for blaming for murder. And that also seems reasonable. And so then we can insert negations in the right places. If you see this, so murdering is not wrong, then can express, yeah, I'm being for not blaming for murdering. And this is different from not being for blaming for murdering, which is the absence of any judgment about murdering. And it's also obviously different from being for blaming for not murdering, which we have here. So this term has enough spaces for negation. So we're happy. But the problem is there's a new negation problem, the revenge version. So now we have explained murdering is not wrong, but now what does murdering is not legal mean? Because murdering is not wrong is being for not blaming for murdering. And because of compositionality, negation has only one meaning. So if we insert a negation in the same space as we did here, murdering is not legal would express being for not proceeding as if murdering is legal. But that's not right, because it should be proceeding as if it's not legal, which is not the same. So you can be for just not proceeding as if something, this is what Luca and I call weak rejections. But you can also be for proceeding as if something is false, which we call strong rejection. So these two need to be kept apart. It seems that the strong rejection, murdering is not legal, on the naive version of the being for account makes the wrong result for negated descriptive claims now. And if you think about this, the problem for the expressivist for murdering is not wrong was we're missing one space for negation. And so then Schlöder creates the space for the negation, but now he has one space too many for descriptive language for the negation. And he has a very clever solution to this, which is almost bilateralist. So he says, well, being for attitudes are actually two attitudes. I mean, a major and a minor being for term, such that the major one entails the minor one. And he says for descriptive language, murdering is legal expresses as a major or primary attitude, being for proceeding as if it's legal, and then being for not proceeding as if it's not legal, which is a strictly weaker claim. And we're just going to take this for granted. I mean, he says this move is motivated by its fruits. Here are the fruits. We can then define a uniform semantics for negation by inserting a not in both terms between the being for and being valid action term. And so we get that for murdering is legal, being for not proceeding as if murder is legal we had before, but we also get being for not, and we eliminate this, so being for proceeding as if murder is not legal, which is what we wanted. So that's good. So now we need to go back to wrong and see if everything still works out. Because we can't do the exact same thing. So the bifurcation, oh, by the way, bifurcation is a pun on B4. Bifurcation of murder is wrong cannot be literally the same thing. We can't just take what we had before and do this double negation move here, because then if we negate this in the same way, we get being for blaming for not murdering again, which is where we started, so we can't do that. So the only solution seems to be for normative vocabulary, like wrong, the major and minor attitudes are just the same. So for descriptive terms, we weaken it, and for normative terms, we just keep with it. And so this might seem ad hoc, but actually I think it's entirely principled. Because if you want to make any sense of what's going on here, you need to draw a line between normative and descriptive vocabulary on the lexical level. The lexical semantics of wrong and the lexical semantics of legal must be somehow different. And this is one way of expressing a difference. This is good. But now there's a new negation problem. And to Schlöder's greatest credit, he notes all of this himself. Like, you just have to read his book to find out all the problems that come. So the question is now, what about epistemic modality? And there's a very elegant way of having epistemic modality in this system. You can just say might A expresses the minor attitude expressed by A. And for descriptive vocabulary, this gives a perfectly fine account of mind. It does a lot of good things. But of course, if for murdering is wrong, the minor and major attitude are the same, then murdering might be wrong and murdering is wrong now expresses the very same. And for this A-type account, there's no good solution for this really inside. Like the book's 11 years old now, there's no good solution. So then Luca and I come along and say, well, what about the B-type version of the same account? And so as we all know, in bilateralism, I don't think this only applies to the plus-minus version of bilateralism, also applies to the Dave Breck version. There's two primitive attitudes, ascent and descent, or two speech lengths, if you will. And so we have been challenged on this, like, is there an explanatory problem here? I mean, have we created the attitude of descent just out of nothing and have entirely failed to explain what it is and what its logical properties are and where it comes from? And how bad is this explanatory problem or the negation problem for us? And the answer is it's not that bad. Because you need to start somewhere. Inconsistency needs to come from somewhere. And while A-type theorists like Schlöder, well, there's an A-type inconsistency, and then he says, like, well, we get rid of B-type by reducing it to A-type. And so he makes, the assumptions he makes are, well, P and not P have incompatible truth conditions, and being 4 transmits these attitudes. And the fact that being 4 does transmit these is not trivial, because there are attitudes that do not transmit inconsistencies, like wonder. So this is a substantial assumption. And as I said, he has an analysis of murder is wrong. And so this apparent B-type inconsistency, murder is wrong and murder is not wrong, is reduced to an A-type inconsistency between 2 being 4 attitudes, so he gets rid of B-type. But the bilateralists, you can think of them as B-type theorists. They also make basic assumptions. We have 2 attitudes, ascent and descent. They are B-type inconsistent, and negation is explained by reference to descent. So we don't, the bilateralists don't presuppose truth condition inconsistency. And then the bilateralist plan is, well, we get rid of A-type inconsistencies, reduce them all to B-type inconsistencies. So murdering is legal and murdering is not legal, which intuitively seem like an A-type inconsistency. They boil down to, well, murdering is legal expresses assent, and murdering is not legal expresses dissent when murdering is legal. These are inconsistent, but they are B-type inconsistent. So the bilateralists are like the dual to the A-type theorists. The A-type theorists say no B-type, we reduce everything to A-type. The bilateralists come along and say no, there's a primitive B-type, reduce all the A-types to this. So there isn't really any way to say who is doing better here on an explanatory level, right? So either theorists, both the A-type and B-type, they take something as basic, some inconsistency as basic. The bilateralists take ascent and dissent are bad as basic, and the A-type theorist takes P and not P, that's basic. And either theorist can cite natural occurrences of these inconsistency, and so even though the A-type theorists may demand an explanation of why it is that ascent and dissent are inconsistent, then the B-type theorist might just turn this around and says, well, you haven't told me why being 4 transmits inconsistency, or why belief transmits inconsistency. And if you want me to cite like some fundamental property of the human mind that explains inconsistency, I can ask you the very same. So let's have a look again at the explanatory problem. There is an explanatory problem if you do things wrong. So if you have both A-type and B-type as basic, then you're in trouble. If you postulate basic attitudes that you can't really investigate or justify their properties linguistically, then you're in trouble. And you're in big trouble if you have attitudes generating new attitudes, like if not as a function that maps attitudes to attitudes, then you get like this huge web of unexplained attitudes. So there is something called an explanatory problem. It's just that the bilateralist doesn't have it. Or she has it to exactly the same degree as the A-type theorist has it. The bilateralist, at least in the Smiley-Rumford or the Brestol-Ripley variation, she has 2, or it's a single inconsistency two simple attitudes that take complex contents, the complexity rests with propositions, and these are linguistically observable to some degree at least. So there is not much to explain here. I said this already. But what's left over is to deal with compositionality and logicality. So these problems are still left over. Right now, what I've done is defend the basic assumption of bilateralism, namely that there are two attitudes which are inconsistent against the explanatory challenge. But the compositionality challenge and logicality challenge is still very much in play, and the bilateralist still owes an explanation of how they will be dealt with. And that's what Luca is going to do now.
Okay, so we are working towards putting forward a mathematical version of inferential expressivism. So what we are going to do now is to say what inferential expressivism is. And the starting point that Julian and I had in our paper was bilateralism, and we've been defending the view that bilateralism can be seen as a form of inferential expressivism. So to say what inferential expressivism is helpful first to remind ourselves what inferentialism and expressivism respectively say. So inferentialism states that the meaning of expression is given or explained in terms of the inferential role, and expressivism states that the meaning of expression is explained in terms of the attitudes that they express. And inferential expressivism states that the meaning of expression is explained in terms of inferences involving attitudes, expressions. And now the question is, why should we think that the bilateralist is an inferential expressivist? Well, the bilateralist takes the meaning of not to be partially given by the fact that from a central node P, one may infer descent from P. So that makes the bilateralist by a characterization of inferential expressivism and just an inferential expressivist. But now, once you make this step, then nothing stops us from extending bilateralism to multilateralism by considering attitudes beyond assent and dissent. And Julian mentioned earlier the explanatory problem, so you need to make sure that these attitudes are linguistically attested, and if you do that, then the explanatory problem won't arise. Okay. So we are going to consider the three speech acts with corresponding attitudes. So we're going following this Malian, the sort of Frege-Malian tradition here. We're going to consider, is it the case that P, yes, this performs the assertion of P and expresses assent to P? Is it the case that P, no, this performs the rejection of P and so expresses dissent from P? And is it the case that P? Perhaps. So we have a third possible answer, and in answering this, the speaker weakly asserts P and expresses weak assent to P. But one might ask, what are these speech acts and corresponding attitudes that we'll be talking about? And one way of answering this question is to embed the speech acts within a Stanley model of conversation. So obviously for assertion, we're going to say Stanley himself says, namely that the essential effect of assent to P is a proposal to add P to the common ground, or to accept such a proposal in case the yes, for instance, is an answer to a proposed update by somebody else. And then for rejection, we can say that its essential effect is to prevent the addition of the relevant proposition to the common ground. And one thing to note here is that once you think of rejections in this way, then you immediately have the result that rejections are not negative. Assertions are like what for instance, for the tradition tell you. So let's consider the dialogue that I also mentioned yesterday, and this loop goes back to twice, although in a different contexts. And Alice here says X or Y will win the election, and Bob responds no, X or Y or Z will win. Now, here Bob is rejecting Alice's assertion, but is not the by asserting the negation of X or Y in the election. Think of a case, for instance, in which Bob thinks that the X, Y, or Z winning the election is even probable. Okay. Now, let's take with the dialogue between Alice and Bob. What's going on when Bob happens no X or Y or Z will win? Well, Bob explicitly dissent from X or Y will win, so that's what happens when it happens. No, but he also seems to implicitly dissent from neither X nor Y will win. So he's also not asserting, as I mentioned, neither X or Y will win, but this seems to be an implicature. And the fact that this is an implicable is suggested by the fact that it seems to be cancelable. So consider, for instance, this continuation of the dialogue. So Alice, as before, says X or Y will win the election, and Bob says, no, X or Y or Z will win. In fact, Z will. Okay, so, and this is useful because it leads us to saying what we take weak assertion to do, because in this case one can say the one explicitly dissents from neither X nor Y by weak assertion. So we said earlier that weak assertion can be performed by actually perhaps, and so suppose that now Bob says perhaps X or Y will win the election, in fact neither of them will. So that's 6 marked. So this means that, or this suggests that a weak assertion of B has the effect of rejecting B. And this would be used for showing when also arguing some rules concerning weak assertion. Okay, so we are now going to embed these speech acts into formal system, and the formal system would be a multilateral one. So in bilateral systems you have 2 false markers, and now having 3 speech acts around, we have 3 false markers. So we'll decorate propositional contents with speech act markers. So class A is going to stand for assent to A, or the assertion of A. I'm freely moving from speech acts to attitudes, so just something to note. And a circle minus will stand for dissent from A, and a circle plus will stand for dissent to A. Okay, and the bilateralist then has to say something about the connection between the speech acts in the formal system, and this is encoded by the coordination principles, and as far as assertion and rejection are concerned, we're just going to adopt the coordination principles for familiar bilateral systems in the Smiley-Murphy tradition. So these are coordination principles that also, a version of those also appeared in Dave's talk. In effect, yesterday, so Dave said that these are highly contentious, we're just going to assume them. So we're going to have that the assertion of A and the rejection of A lead to absurdity, and that if the supposition that the speaker has asserted A leads to absurdity, then the speaker is taken to have already committed to the rejection of A, and that if the supposition that the speaker has rejected A leads to absurdity, then the speaker is already taken to have asserted A, or at least to be committed better to have asserted. Okay, and now we give rules characterizing the meaning of not, and the rules are justified on the basis of what I said earlier about weak assertion and rejection. So remember that we said that the essential effect of a weak assertion of A is to reject its negation. Well, then we have a rule that allows us to pass from the weak assertion of A to the rejection of not A, and vice versa. And for similar reasons, from the rejection of A, we can infer the weak assertion of not A, and vice versa. Note, by the way, how strikingly harmonious these are, because the elimination rule is just the symmetrical of the introduction. Okay, but then what about the assertion of not A? What about plus not A? And to say something about that, it's useful to first introduce rules for perhaps and might. So telling us something about the relationship between weak assertion and immediate case. Okay. So one thing that Julian and I observed in our weak assertion paper was that it looks as if the same consequences can be drawn from an assertion of, say, it might be that it's raining, and perhaps it is raining. So these assumptions are a rule that tells you that from the weak assertion of A, you can infer the assertion of might A, and vice versa. And similarly, it looks as if the same consequences can be inferred from perhaps might B and perhaps B. So for this reason, we have rules that tell us that from the weak assertion of A, you can infer the weak assertion of might A, and vice versa. Again, these rules are strikingly harmonious. Okay, once we have these rules in place, we can derive two rules that tell us about the assertion of negation, about plus not A. That is, now we have a rule that tells us that from the rejection of might A, we can infer the assertion of not A, and vice versa. Okay, but we want to say something more. So now we want to ask, what's the difference between rejecting A and rejecting might A? And given the equivalence that those rules told us between rejecting might A and plus not A, this is tantamount to asking, what's the difference between rejecting A and rejecting and accepting not A? Well, we want to put it in this way, that the attitude of assent is stable in the following sense, that if I assent to some A, then it would be a change of mind to stop assenting to A. So the attitudes of dissent and weak assent, on the other hand, are unstable in this sense. So the point is that one may come to stop dissenting by merely receiving new information. So when if I have assented to A, then if I stop assenting to A, if I think of it in terms of the common ground, then this requires some change that's been accepted. Okay, and just to expand on this point, consider again the dialogue between Alice and Bob. So here, Bob says no X or Y that will win, so the no expresses the dissent from X or Y that will win, and the subsequent remark, X or Y that will win, expresses assent to X or Y Z. Now suppose that later Bob expresses assent to Z will not win, then he after all assents to X or Y will win, but no revision of anything was required for this. Okay, and we finally want to give some principles that coordinate assertion and weak assertion, because we gave coordination principles for assertion and rejection, but we haven't said how assertion and weak assertion are coordinated, and recall that assent and dissent stand in a bitartic consistency relation. This is what in effect the coordination principles told us. Now the point is that assent and weak assent stand in a bitartic intermediate relation similar to what some people think the relation between certainty and belief. So in particular we have that from the assertion of A, you can infer the weak assertion of A, and that weak assertion is preserved under entailment, roughly. There are some restrictions here that I won't pose on, and that there are technical reasons if you want to discuss them. Okay, what does the logical epistemic models that result from this looks like? Well, it has quite a few nice properties. So we have that ascent is classical in the following sense, that if B is derivable from a classical logic, then the assertion of B is derivable from the assertion of A in the system, which we call epistemic multilateral logic. We have that epistemic contradictions, also known as Yeltsin sentences, so sentences of the form A might be the not A, they asserting that it's contradictory, but we have that, on the other hand, might is not factive, which is the main challenge that you have when you want to say that these kind of things are contradictory. And then we have the rejection and dissent are indeed weak. So we have that from the rejection of A, the assertion of not A doesn't follow, and we have the negation doesn't entail dissent, which is what we want. That is that if you accept not A, then rejection. Okay, so finally, we are, I think, around slide 40, we can get to multilateralism about ethics. And part of the point is that this is now very simple. Once we made this groundwork, because now we can write D for the attitude of disapproval, and we can just say for wrong that from disapproval of A, you can infer the assertion of A is wrong, and from the assertion of A is wrong, you can infer disapproval of A. So that means that actually murdering is not wrong expresses the assertion or the negation of murdering is wrong, and the mean of this is given by the rules for negation of wrong. So this is the inferentialist component of the approach. And we had two outstanding problems left. One was the logicality problem, and the other one was the propositionality problem. And obviously, plus A and plus not A give us a contradiction for any A. So logicality is immediately solved, and the meaning of negation is uniform, which is given by the rules that I gave earlier. So this solves propositionality. Okay. But you might ask, what does that mean? So I told you, I've given you this inferentialist explanation, so you might say, okay, but what does that amount to? Well, let's think about not there. So actually murdering is not wrong, entails dissent from murder is wrong, just by what not means inferentially. But already murdering might not be wrong, entails dissent from murder is wrong. But murdering is not wrong entails stable dissent. So it means, in particular, that the speaker won't accept disapproval of murdering, and it will be a change of mind for her. Okay. And of course, one can say, okay, look, we can abbreviate stable dissent of disapproval as tolerance now. And that could actually be helpful in some cases, but it's a shorthand for us. Officially, so we don't need to postulate any primitive attitude tolerance. Okay, and there are interesting similarities between what we say and what Schlöder says, because assent is akin to being for proceeding as if, and weak assent is akin to being for not proceeding as if. Not, and dissent is akin to being for not proceeding as if. But we don't have a new negation problem, and we don't have a new negation problem, so it's worth posing a bit on where we draw the distinction between descriptive and normative vocabulary. So what happens is that we make a lexical level distinction between descriptive and normative terms, and Schlöder that's the same, but on our approach, what's going on is that the descriptive terms have, as we put it, attitude invariant differential semantics. That means that from the assertion of X is a bachelor, you can infer, for instance, that the assertion of X is a marriage. But in the case of normative terms, the inferential semantics is attitude switching. So from the assertion of A is wrong, you can infer it's a true. So, as I said, Schlöder 2 makes a distinction at the lexical level, and this is how it should be. We think that the advantage of our approach is that we don't have a new negation problem. And there's also something to note here, because our account explains why it appears as if negating descriptions is negating content, but negating normative claims is negating attitude, because you can immediately infer the attitude from the assertion of A is wrong. Okay. Conclusion: bilateralism doesn't have a negation problem, and in fact, we think that bilateralism can be extended to, say, expressivism from the negation problem, and it's useful to maybe say something about where inferential expressivism about ethics sits in the metaethical landscape. And there are some similarities here with what is known as hybrid expressivism that has been defended, for instance, by people like Mike Ridge. And hybrid expressivism says that when you utter a sentence with normative recovery, then you are expressing something cognitive and something non-cognitive. So you really have these two different levels, and roughly the sort of cognitive descriptive level is going to solve the Frege-Leach problem, and then the non-cognitive level is going to give you the kind of nice things that expressivist wants, like the integrating power of moral judgments. But one standard objection to hybrid accounts is that, okay, we're putting these two layers, these things ad hoc, we've not been told anything about how they interact, and we say how the normative component and the descriptive component, so the cognitive and non-cognitive component, interact. And also, there's an important difference, and that's where between the two accounts, because on our view, when you utter a sentence with normative vocabulary, you're expressing something cognitive that is explained by something non-cognitive via the inferential connections.